and welcome to my horror film presentation, Codes and Conventions, with the one and only Leo Bolsover. Right, let's get into it. We'll begin by talking about character codes and conventions. So, we'll begin with the token character, seemingly designed to mark the diversity box of the film. Muscular, confident, never survives, and conventionally used to show that a killing spree is about to begin. A good example of the token character portrayed in a horror can appear in The Shining with the character Dick Halloran. Moving on, we've got the blonde. Typically attractive, mindless character with a very lively imagination. An iconic example of the blonde portrayed in a horror can be Marion Crane in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Moving on, we've got the jock. Most likely tall, handsome, muscular, has a tough facade, obnoxious, jerk-like attitude, dies violently encountering an antagonist without a plan. An example of a jock portrayed in a horror can be Stephen Orff from 1996 horror hit Scream. Then we have the couple. Seemingly the blonde and the jock, or another in a relationship, add sex appeal and eroticism in the film, in which they will typically die in that act. An instance of the couple can be portrayed in a horror can be Friday the 13th 2 from 1981, which Jeff and Sandra are killed in the act. The septic, intelligent, never panics or exaggerates, and stays calm. An example of the septic in a horror can feature in 2006 horror hit Final Destination 3 in character Ian McKinley. The loner, standard average looking, gender neutral character, typically different from the rest and is always in the background. Cynical attitude, has helpful ideas, however is genuinely ignored. An example of a loner in a horror can again be seen from 1996 horror hit Scream in character Randy. An expositioner, often not a part of the victim group, typically old, gender neutral, elderly individual which understands why all this is happening and is aware of the backstory or have a solution to prevent the antagonist. Narrative conventions, locations and settings. Locations and settings are used to fit the expectations of the audience as well as setting an atmosphere. Good examples of this, dark isolated woods, with an example from Slender from 2018. Dark locations makes you unaware of the surroundings which builds tension, as well as isolated settings, locations forces the audience to feel trapped and build anxiety. Castles, unusual, inhabited, an example from The Nun 2018 also. Secluded locations, graveyards, uneasy setting. The weather tends to be cold, dark, raining. If abandoned structures, as you know, you're unaware of what's inside. Typically, also a feeling of isolation. An example can be shown from the abandoned house from the It 2017 reboot. A key example of a location can be Jaws 1975. Majority of the film's killing takes place out at sea. The sea is a great example of a dark, isolated area as no one can see what's beneath it. So leave it to their imagination. So moving on, we've got narrative conventions, storylines. Typical storylines, narrative structure in horror often have similar conventions. We have a hero slash protagonist, often known as the final girl of the film, due to being a final victim, typically the main character who must embark on something in order to save themselves or others around them. Countless examples of the final girl have appeared throughout horrors, such as Nancy Holbrook in the 2010 reboot Nightmare on Elm Street. Next, we have the death by sex. A typical slasher convention usually involves the couple. Commonly used as the couple will forget their surroundings and will especially be vulnerable to death. Could possibly be a metaphor for the AIDS scare in case of older films. As a result, more people having unprotected sex. It was suspected to be used as a cautionary message of being punished during the act if you did unprotected sex. As shown before, Jeff and Randy were killed in the act from Friday the 13th 2. False ending. An ending trope which ends the sequence yet reveals a major threat is still out there. It creates a doubt of whether a final victory has been achieved. Typically used in order to create a sequel hook. This convention has been used time and time again throughout horrors over the decades, most ironically Nightmare on Elm Street's false endings in which killer Freddy Krueger never seems to vanish, or Final Destination 5's ending, which reveals it's in fact taking place in the events of the first film. The monster or killer. The most important feature of the film, typically an unstoppable force. Without the monster and the threat which imposes the normal world, there would be no horror aspect to speak of. It's the idea of the otherness which is key to defining the key element of the monster. They have a trademark style of killing, for example, Freddy Krueger's dream sequences, Jason Voorhees' iconic machete, or Ghostface's phone call murdering spree. The monsters and killer societal impact. Occasions when fiction seeps into real-world impacts and influences due to the horror characters. For example, Tim Curry's performance in the homicidal clown Pennywise in the 1990 miniseries is often cited as the source of childhood nightmares and coulrophobia, or otherwise known as a fear of clowns. In similar fashion, after an on-screen return of Pennywise the Clown in 2017's It, causing mass hysteria with sightings of killer clowns around the globe. Another similar occurrence after 1975's hit Jaws revealed that 43% of kids under the age of 13 who saw the movie enjoyed fears of swimming even years after the movie's release. Industries have also been able to majorly capitalize on the success of such horror films, with such as ghost tours being held at the Stanley Hotel from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. The group of teens or young adults. Countless horror flicks involve a small group of young teens/adults. It can involve the defenselessness of the characters, which include alcohol, sex, etc., appealing to younger audiences for the relatability that the characters hold. Typically, horror budgets tend to be low budget, with upcoming talent able to be secured for much cheaper. The target demographic for horror content are younger. The younger actors allow them to be more identifiable, relatability, as well as being more susceptible to being scared. Most characters tend to meet the thin line between innocence and maturity, offering a lot of thematic scope. Moving on to film techniques and camera work then. Focusing on camera work and shot design within horror conveys emotion through three different factors, which are movement, placement, and lens. We start with a film technique known as the Dutch tilt or angle, also known as the oblique angle shot, or Dutch tilt, is a shot with a tilt on the camera's roll axis. The tilted angle is used in an attempt to make the audience uneasy as of its unnatural angle, signaling something is wrong, disorientating, or unsettled. These shots are used by filmmakers for impact and add a lot of dramatic tension. First pioneered by Robert Wiene in the 1920 horror film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, inspiring into mainstream cinema. Next, we've got the low angle. These shots are very powerful in how they assert how frightening a villain is and can convey power in a character. Has the effect on the audience of feeling weak or insignificant. Commonly used throughout the genre to add sense of reality, immersing the audience into feeling that they are there. As well as conveying power, it can also convey vulnerability, showcasing how small a subject is in comparison to another subject. For example, a low angle would emphasize how truly intimidating and frightful an antagonist is through its use. Another technique we've got is the underexpose, simply known as adjusting the brightness of a shot. When utilized correctly, it can create mysterious scene capturing. It creates an overwhelming sense of dread. It plays with the viewer's sense of what they can see in the shot. The use of underexposed shots can be utilized frequently and effectively throughout the Paranormal Activity series. Film techniques, close-up angle, a shot which typically adds a form of emotion to a scene and you can feel what the character feels. A slow pan, anxiety-inducing, used to delay a reaction in addition to building up tension and setting up expectations for the inevitable scare subject. A great example of the use of the slow pan technique can be seen again from Paranormal Activity franchise, which takes the approach of using found footage, incorporates the slow pan into that structure very effectively. We've got the POV, also known as person of view. It's a technique to let the viewer know what the character is looking at. This technique helps forge a connection between the audience and the characters, as well as we see through their perspective. An iconic use of this technique is showcased in John Carpenter's Halloween opening sequence. We've got the high angle, when the camera is placed above a subject with the lens pointing down, making the subject appear small and vulnerable. It can convey isolation and susceptibility. In addition to making subjects appear small, it can also be used to portray a sense of surveillance. Camera work. Handheld. It doesn't rely on a fixed camera position, usually portrayed through found footage. Makes the audience feel a part of the action as it's being seen on a character's recording. Famously utilised in the Blair Witch Project. A long shot, an establishing shot from a considerable distance, establishes how remote a subject is and can convey the feeling of isolation and solidarity. Moving on to lighting techniques then. So a backlight creates tension by obscuring what's in front of us, creates a silhouette or shadow, creates the effect on the audience that they can see it coming, but they don't exactly know what is coming, which builds anxiety. Low-key lighting. The dim hue and shadows created by low-key lighting create tension and an unsettling feeling due to its mysterious and dark atmosphere. Spotlighting slowly builds tension by leading the viewer's eyes through a scene to a specific subject. Saturated red adds the feeling of immediate danger by adding highly saturated red gels to lights. Uplifting unnatural looking by and distorts subjects. The light from below changes the angles and shadows of the subject in a way that makes them feel unfamiliar and off-putting to the viewer. Can be achieved by a light down below from a subject. Shadow lighting can be used to portray something as large and frightening due to its lack of features. Darkness helps in horror as it leaves room for imagination. Moving on to film techniques, editing. In regards to editing in horror, a lot of aspects are taken into consideration. Those three being pace, editing techniques, sound, and music, or audio. So pace. The pacing in a horror film tend to be fast-paced, which is done to build tension as well as a sense of dramatic urgency for viewers. Editing at a fast pace disorients the audience, allowing them to feel uneasy. Typically mixed with a few scenes containing slow-paced editing, as this gives the audience a sense of security before being scared, adding a surprising element. Suspense is built on the audience's anticipation, which grows suspense in which the use of fast-paced short clips edited together will allow this. Moving on to editing techniques then. Elliptical editing, cutting out unnecessary shots such as journeys or unnecessary actions in a result to keep the audience gripped or on the edge of their seats. Cross-cutting, by cutting back and forth in different situations, can play with the audience's emotions due to the unawareness of what the camera is going to cut back to. The camera has complete control on how and when we get the information. Parallel cuts, manipulating the viewer into thinking they're seeing something that they aren't. It forces the viewer to think, elaborate, put all the pieces together. It offers the audience something they think they know and then rips the reality out of it. Long cuts, not cutting away from a scene at all for an uncomfortable period of time, making the viewer consume the horror of the scene. So, next we have sound. Horror films are great at using audio and sound to compound the anxiety that you feel as you witness events unfold on screen. Humans naturally react to audio stimuli before visual. Therefore, if a sound is unrecognizable to the brain, it immediately has the audience on edge. Anything difficult to the human brain to process is helpful for inducing fear. The sound also assists in creating an atmosphere. Typically, most soundtracks in horror consist of a lot of tension and suspense. An iconic example of this can be John Williams' score for 1975's Jaws. Moving on to horror film platforms, festivals, and competitions. Competitions and festivals are held globally, celebrating and showcasing the genre. We'll start with HorrorCon. HorrorCon UK is the UK's original annual horror convention. More a horror party than your average convention. It's an opportunity in an atmospheric space where like-minded folks can meet to celebrate the weird and wonderful world of horror. It's a chance to meet and speak with some of the most iconic names within the horror genre. And finally, For the Love of Horror. For the Love of Horror, like many other fan conventions and Comic Cons, is a place where fans of pop culture, films, TV, comic books, and more can meet and greet their favourite actors and actresses, have photographs with them, get autographs. Our special guests always attend question and answer panels, as well as fans can interact with them on less crowded level without being hustle and bustle of the main convention behind them.